Imagine knowing that this letter was written by someone who hunted human beings like prey, who killed for pleasure, who laughed at lawmen and newspapers and the people who trembled in their homes. He called himself Zodiac, and for decades he has been a ghost, untouchable, untamed, unbroken, a killer who may still walk among us. This is not just the story of murder. It is the story of a game that America never knew it was playing, a psychological snare set by a man who understood fear like a master craftsman. Every shot fired, every stabbing, every blood-soaked message left behind, it wasn't chaos. It was choreography, a ritual of dominance. And while the world was watching, desperate for answers, the Zodiac wasn't hiding. He was performing. Think about that for a moment. The man who gunned down couples in the dark, who carved his symbols into letters and mailed them to newspapers, wasn't trying to disappear. He wanted you to see. He wanted you to feel his power. He wanted you to realize the truth, that the system sworn to protect you could not protect you at all. The Zodiac story begins not with a body, but with a silence. The silence of law enforcement, of institutions too slow, too arrogant, too compromised to stop him. He knew their weaknesses, their rivalries, their failures, and he exploited them. With every killing, with every unsolved cipher, he carved his name into America's subconscious, not just as a murderer, but as a symbol. A shadow that proved control was always an illusion. And tonight, I'm going to take you deeper than the headlines, deeper than the cheap documentaries, deeper than the hollow speculation. Because behind the myth, behind the codes and the fear, lies something darker, a pattern that connects the Zodiac not just to crime, but to a system of manipulation that has ruled humanity for centuries. You were never meant to see this pattern. But once you do, you'll never unsee it. The first killing attributed to the Zodiac was not a random act of violence, but an initiation, a strike chosen with precision, meant to test the boundaries of fear and the limits of authority. December 20th, 1968, a lonely lover's lane in Vallejo, California. Two teenagers, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, parked along a gravel road, believing themselves hidden in the dark safety of young love. But the darkness that approached them was not natural. It was constructed, designed, a predator's silence masking footsteps that led to their execution. No robbery, no sexual assault, no personal vendetta, just cold elimination. Betty Lou shot 5 times in the back as she tried to flee. David executed with a bullet to the head. No word spoken, no mercy shown. And when the police arrived, they found more than bodies. They found a message without words. The killer had acted as if the law did not exist. The police scrambled, reporters circled, families wept. But the killer was calm. He had begun the story on his terms, and soon he would make sure the entire state of California knew it. Letters would follow, ciphers scratched in blood-curdled logic, symbols that mocked every institution claiming authority over society. He wasn't just saying, "I killed them." He was saying, "I control you." The press printed his letters. The public devoured them. Law enforcement agencies bickered and clashed over jurisdiction, feeding the very chaos he thrived upon. And behind it all, the Zodiac was watching, laughing not simply at the lives he stole, but at the realization that power was not in bullets or knives, but in the theater of fear. Vallejo was just the opening act, the sacrifice that set the stage for a new kind of warfare. One not fought with armies, but with psychology, with media manipulation, with codes that dangled unsolved, like a string dragging the nation deeper into his labyrinth. To most, this was a series of brutal crimes. But to the Zodiac, it was ritual, And rituals are never random. They are designed to transform, to shift the balance of power from the authorities who thought they ruled America's streets to the shadow figure who showed them otherwise. July 4th, 1969, America's night of fireworks, freedom, and celebration, became the Zodiac's chosen stage for his second act, because predators like him did not strike randomly. They chose symbols, and what greater irony than to bleed a young couple beneath the thunder of rockets bursting in the sky, while a nation toasted liberty, blind to the trap closing around it. That night, Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau sat in a car at Blue Rock Springs Park when headlights cut through the darkness and out stepped a figure who seemed almost mechanical in his precision. No hesitation, no wasted motion, only calculated violence. Bullets shattered glass, shredded flesh, and when Mike survived against the odds, he carried with him not just wounds, but testimony that would haunt investigators for decades. The killer had moved with calm detachment, almost as if rehearsing a ritual he had perfected long before. The following month, the letters came, mailed to 3 newspapers, signed with the chilling symbol that would brand his reign, a circle with a cross, a counterfeit compass, an emblem of domination. Inside were ciphers, promising his identity to whoever could unlock the code, yet what he truly revealed was not a name, but a strategy. He understood that murder alone was not enough. Fear had to spread like an infection, and the press was his delivery system. By forcing newspapers into his game, he ensured his shadow reached every living room in California, and soon after, every household in America. Each letter, each cipher, was a seed planted in the minds of millions, germinating doubt in the competence of police, stirring the suspicion that evil could not just exist, but thrive unpunished, untraceable, untouchable. This was not merely homicide, it was a demonstration that control itself could be hijacked, that the structures designed to contain chaos could be inverted into weapons. Ask yourself, was this truly one man, or was it something larger, something orchestrated, something that revealed how fragile the boundary between order and anarchy truly is? Because when the Zodiac pressed his circle cross onto paper, he was not only marking his presence, he was branding a nation with the reminder that power does not belong to the authorities we are told to trust, but to whoever dares to seize it. And in that moment, he seized America's mind. The ciphers were more than puzzles. They were weapons, crafted not to reveal truth, but to tighten his grip over a population that was beginning to realize the system protecting them was built on sand. On July 31st, 1969, 3 newspapers each received a letter from the Zodiac, demanding publication or he would claim more lives, a declaration that instantly turned the press into his accomplices. The so-called 408-character cipher promised to unveil his name, yet when finally solved, it revealed not an identity, but a philosophy, a chilling creed that spoke of collecting slaves for the afterlife, of pleasure taken in hunting human beings as if they were sport, of power beyond mortal law. He understood something the public had not yet realized. Fear expands when unanswered questions linger, and a code that taunts the mind is far more enduring than a confession written in plain words. Even as cryptographers raced to solve his riddles, the killer had already won because the conversation was no longer about the victims. It was about him. He had inverted the spotlight, making himself the protagonist in a theater of dread, with police reduced to background actors stumbling in confusion. Imagine what that does to a society, when the supposed guardians of order appear powerless, mocked openly in newspapers read by millions. The Zodiac was not just killing bodies. He was assassinating faith in authority, stripping away the illusion that law enforcement was in control. That is why his symbol mattered, why it burned itself into headlines and nightmares. It was not a random doodle, but a sigil of domination, a constant reminder that he was everywhere and nowhere, watching, laughing, daring anyone to challenge his supremacy. And what did the institutions do? They printed his words, they fed his myth, They allowed his narrative to spread unchecked because they feared what would happen if they ignored him. This was not just a criminal strategy. It was psychological warfare, the same kind used by intelligence agencies, the same methods employed by secret powers throughout history to bend populations into submission. The Zodiac had tapped into something ancient. The truth that terror is most effective when it hides behind symbols, ciphers, and whispers, because then it multiplies, it infects, it transforms ordinary men into trembling believers in a force they cannot name, a predator they cannot cage. September 27, 1969, Lake Berryessa, a place of water, sunlight, and leisure, chosen with surgical precision to remind the world that nowhere was safe. Not the dark highways, not the back seats of parked cars, not even the pastoral calm of a lake. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard lay on a blanket, unaware that the shadow approaching them carried not only a gun and knife, but the full weight of a mythology he was writing into existence. The figure wore a black executioner's hood marked with the circle cross, a living emblem of terror, as if death itself had taken human form and walked among them. He bound their hands with plastic clothesline, spoke calmly, methodically, explaining he only needed their car, crafting a lie to lower their resistance, before plunging the blade again and again into their bodies, each thrust less an act of murder than a declaration of dominion, an initiation rite meant to scar the American psyche forever. Cecilia would die from her wounds, Brian would live to testify, and yet survival only deepened the terror because his words carried the image of the Zodiac into every living room, his description of the hood, the symbol, the controlled cruelty reinforcing that this killer was not just a man, but a force. Before leaving, the Zodiac etched his mark into Hartnell's car door, inscribing the dates of his previous murders alongside his symbol, like a sorcerer carving runes into stone. A ritual of ownership, proof that the killings were not disconnected crimes, but chapters in a larger liturgy of power. Hours later, a call came into the Napa County Sheriff's Office from a payphone only blocks away. The killer himself confessing in his calm, chilling cadence, "I want to report a murder." He gave directions, signed off with his name, Zodiac, then hung up, unhurried, unconcerned, untouchable. This was not desperation. This was orchestration. Heavy, eerie action calculated not merely to take life, but to script a narrative, to bend institutions into his theater of horror, to show the public that even survival would not save them, because living witnesses only amplified his reach. Think about that. A man kills in daylight, calls the police himself, and walks away unseen, untouched. What does that reveal about the world we live in? That the structures meant to cage evil are illusions, and the ones who truly hold power are those willing to step outside morality, outside law, and impose their will with symbols, ritual, and blood. The Zodiac was not hiding. He was performing, and America was his audience. October 11, 1969, San Francisco. A city alive with the pulse of rebellion, counterculture, and restless energy, a place where police patrols were thick, where the Zodiac should have been cautious, but instead he chose to strike openly, as if daring the entire system to stop him. Paul Stein, a cab driver, picked up a fare near Union Square, unaware that the passenger in the back seat carried not just a gun, but an agenda to mock the very fabric of law enforcement. At the corner of Washington and Cherry, shots cracked the air, a bullet tearing through Stein's skull, blood flooding the taxi, as the killer calmly wiped down the vehicle, tore a piece of the driver's shirt, and vanished into the suburban streets. Children across the street watched from their window, giving police a description of a man walking away. But here the story fractures into something darker, because responding officers, armed with the exact description, stopped a man fitting it perfectly, spoke with him, and then let him go. Why? Because the dispatcher, in what some call incompetence and others call something more sinister, had reported the suspect as a black male. And so the Zodiac, a white man covered in evidence, walked into the night unchallenged, untouched, laughing at the very guardians sworn to catch him. Hours later, another letter arrived, this time not just taunting but escalating. He included the bloody fragment of Stein's shirt as proof, an artifact of murder packaged like a trophy that told the city one truth: your police do not protect you. The press printed his threats of attacking school buses, of picking off children one by one, a vision so horrifying that for weeks officers followed buses with rifles at the ready, parents clutching their children with white knuckles, the city paralyzed by the idea that their daily routines could dissolve into slaughter. This was not random violence. This was a performance of dominance, a demonstration that institutions built to control society could be mocked, manipulated, humiliated. He had proven his reach was not confined to dark highways or secluded lovers' lanes. It stretched into the heart of a major city, beneath the very gaze of its police force. And in this moment, the Zodiac became more than a killer. He became a mirror, reflecting the fragility of authority, the cracks in the facade of safety, and the terrifying reality that evil thrives not because it is hidden, but because it moves in plain sight, shielded by error, by arrogance, and perhaps by something even more deliberate. By now the killings themselves had become almost secondary, because the true weapon the Zodiac wielded was not his gun or his knife, but his words, the endless stream of letters, ciphers, and threats that poured into the offices of newspapers and police stations, each one more theatrical than the last, each one carefully designed to humiliate the authorities and tighten his hold on the public imagination. He boasted of past murders, threatened new ones, and demanded his symbol be worn on buttons across the city, as if daring San Francisco to wear his mark openly, to bow before him in ritual submission. When those demands went unmet, he promised fresh blood, and though many of his threats never materialized, it didn't matter, because the real damage was already done. Parents clutched their children tighter, lovers avoided lonely roads, and school buses moved under armed escort, all because one man had declared himself untouchable. His letters dripped with arrogance, mocking the police as blue pigs, laughing at their failures, reminding them of the cab driver's shirt still in his possession, proof that he could step into the heart of their city and kill under their noses. The newspapers, trapped in a dilemma, printed his words to prevent further violence, but in doing so, they became the vessel of his myth, the amplifiers of his voice. The Zodiac understood something primal. Fear spreads faster than bullets, and a society that sees its guardians mocked and powerless begins to unravel, begins to question whether order itself is nothing but a fragile illusion. The case files swelled with evidence. The detectives worked around the clock, yet the killer remained always one step ahead, not because he was a ghost, but because he was a master of control, feeding them scraps of truth, fragments of riddles, always enough to provoke but never enough to catch. Each cipher became a theater of obsession, drawing in not just cryptographers but ordinary citizens who scoured newspapers late into the night, searching for patterns, for meaning, for the unmasking of a terror that seemed more idea than man. And that was his genius. He understood that even if the killing stopped, the legend would live on, because what he truly murdered was not only flesh, but certainty. The certainty that evil was distant, containable, answerable to justice. The Zodiac proved it was none of those things. It was here, it was now, and it wore a smile carved into letters dripping with contempt. As the years dragged on, the Zodiac's presence mutated from immediate terror into something far more insidious, a myth that slipped its leash and began to wander through the culture itself, infecting minds, spawning imitators, and blurring the line between fact and theater. Letters arrived that police could never quite verify, some laced with authentic detail, others likely forged by hoaxers hungry for a share of the spotlight. But in the end it hardly mattered, because every new communication kept the fear alive, Every scrap of handwriting reignited the possibility that he was still out there, watching, waiting, playing his game. Rumors spread that he had infiltrated law enforcement, that he worked inside the military, that he was a genius living quietly among neighbors who would never suspect the darkness sitting across their picket fences. Some whispered that the bungled stop in San Francisco had not been an accident at all, but a deliberate release, that the police had brushed past him knowingly, protecting a man too powerful, too connected to fall. And in this storm of uncertainty, the Zodiac ceased to be merely a killer. He became a ghost story woven into the very fabric of America, his circle cross symbol appearing in graffiti, in whispered dares, in the nightmares of children who had not even been born when he first struck. Hollywood would later seize his image, true crime writers would feast on the case, and armchair detectives would spend decades tearing apart his ciphers, convinced the solution was always just one symbol away. Yet each failure only amplified his legend, because a riddle without an answer is more terrifying than one that can be solved. The hoaxes, the false leads, the crackling paranoia of a public unable to tell real threats from imagined ones, all of it strengthened his legacy, because the Zodiac was no longer bound to flesh and bone. He had ascended into something archetypal, a symbol of the predator lurking just beyond the reach of order, a reminder that evil does not die when bodies fall cold, but lingers, reshaping itself into stories, into whispers, into culture. The longer he remained free, the more unstoppable he seemed, and in that freedom lay the cruelest truth of all. The Zodiac did not need to kill again to keep killing, because the fear he planted had taken root, and it would never stop growing. The investigation became a labyrinth without end, a machine that consumed years of human effort, careers of detectives, mountains of evidence, and yet always delivered the same result: nothing. Suspects emerged by the dozens, each one paraded in front of the public as a possible face of the Zodiac, and each one slipping away into the void of inconclusive evidence. Arthur Lee Allen, the school teacher with a violent streak and disturbing obsessions, became the most infamous of them all, his name tied to the case so tightly that many remained convinced he was the killer, yet every hard piece of evidence, handwriting, fingerprints, DNA, either failed to match or dissolved into ambiguity. Others came under suspicion too, men with criminal records, ex-military figures, loners who fit the psychological profile, even those who wrote taunting letters of their own, feeding on the terror the Zodiac left behind. Each time, investigators thought they were close, only to watch the case collapse into uncertainty. And beneath these failures lay a deeper rot: files misplaced, evidence mishandled, leads ignored, agencies refusing to cooperate, each police department guarding its own turf instead of uniting against the shadow that stalked them all. This fragmentation was a gift to the Zodiac, because while the public believed the authorities were in pursuit, the truth was that bureaucracy, ego, and sheer human error crippled the chase from the inside. With every misstep, his myth swelled larger, as though he had designed the chaos himself, as though the system had always been his true victim. Even the introduction of modern forensics decades later, DNA analysis, handwriting technology, computer-assisted cipher decryption, failed to break the spell, leaving investigators chasing ghosts that slipped through their fingers like smoke. The case files became a graveyard of false hopes, a suspect a dead end, each new technology another reminder that certainty remained forever just out of reach. And through it all, the symbol lingered, etched into crime scene photos, plastered across newspaper archives, whispered in late-night conversations, proof that the man might have disappeared, but the wound he carved into American memory never closed. What does it say about a society when its greatest detectives, armed with the most advanced tools of science, could not cage a single man? Perhaps it says he was never simply a man at all, but something larger, an idea, a sickness in the culture, a mask anyone could wear. And perhaps that is why the Zodiac was never caught, because the true suspect was not hiding in a house or a cabin or a shadowed street, but in the collective psyche itself. In the decades that followed, the Zodiac case refused to die, transforming from an open wound in California into an obsession that stretched across generations, drawing in not only law enforcement, but countless amateur sleuths, conspiracy theorists, and opportunists who all sought to claim the uncatchable prize of unmasking him. Books filled shelves with confident declarations of his identity, documentaries dissected suspects with surgical precision, and online forums became digital cathedrals where believers pored over the same tired evidence, convinced that the key lay just beyond the next discovery. Each new theory added another layer to the myth. Some claimed he was a lone predator. Others insisted he was part of a network, an experiment, even a creation of the government itself. Theories emerged that the Zodiac had infiltrated the very institutions designed to capture him, that his letters contained not only ciphers but hidden codes tied to intelligence agencies or secret societies, that his survival depended on a protection far greater than chance. And with every passing decade, the hunger to solve the case only intensified, because unsolved mysteries demand answers, and the longer they remain unanswered, the more monstrous they become. The emergence of DNA forensics promised hope, yet again the evidence was inconclusive, degraded, or conveniently absent, fueling suspicion that truth was being withheld. Even the internet age, with millions of eyes and algorithms combing through the fragments, has failed to deliver resolution, and in that failure, the Zodiac's power remains intact, perhaps even stronger, because he has achieved what most killers cannot: immortality. He is no longer bound to the crimes of the 1960s. He exists as a symbol of fear that adapts with the times, a dark presence lurking in the collective imagination, his circle-cross sigil as potent today as it was scrawled in blood on that October night. And so the question remains: did the Zodiac simply stop, vanish into anonymity, die without fanfare, or does he still walk among us, smiling as the world chases shadows he left behind? The inability to answer that question is his final victory, because in the end, the Zodiac was never about the bodies he left in ditches or cars. It was about the story he wrote in the veins of a nation, a story that still refuses to end. And so we arrive at the cruelest truth of all. The Zodiac's greatest crime was not the bodies that fell beneath his gun or his knife, but the transformation of himself into an eternal myth, a phantom stitched into the fabric of fear itself, immune to time, immune to justice, immune to death. Most killers fade when their crimes end, their names reduced to entries in police archives and forgotten newspaper clippings. But the Zodiac engineered something different. He wrote himself into history as an unsolvable riddle, ensuring that every generation to come would keep whispering his name, chasing his ciphers, reanimating his shadow with every new theory and every unanswered question. He understood that terror is not sustained by blood alone, but by mystery, by the absence of closure, by the haunting suggestion that the killer might still be out there, hidden in plain sight, smiling at our obsession. That is why his case endures long after his crimes ceased, why his circle-cross sigil has become one of the most recognizable symbols of evil in modern culture, why his legend has outlived his victims. The Zodiac didn't just kill people. He killed certainty. He killed faith in authority. He killed the comforting belief that order can always overcome chaos. And perhaps that is why no solution, no suspect, no confession has ever truly satisfied, because even if his identity were revealed tomorrow, even if DNA proved beyond doubt who he was, the myth would remain untouchable, preserved in the decades of fear, speculation, and obsession that followed. The Zodiac is no longer a man to be caught or unmasked. He is a story that cannot be killed, a question mark carved into the heart of American history, an echo that will continue to whisper long after everyone who lived through his reign of terror is gone. In the end, he achieved what he set out to do, to prove that the most terrifying monsters are not those who strike once and are buried, but those who find a way to live forever. And so, as the screen fades and the story circles back to silence, one question lingers like a shadow stretching far beyond the crimes themselves. What if he is still out there, not as the aging man hunched over forgotten memories, but as an idea that refuses to die, an echo that finds new life each time his name is spoken, each time his cipher is reopened, each time a fresh pair of eyes stares into the puzzle and convinces itself that the answer is within reach? Perhaps he walks unnoticed among us, his past sealed by time and the erosion of memory, or perhaps he left this world long ago, buried in an unmarked grave, his secret identity locked forever in the dirt. Yet it hardly matters, because the terror he seeded was never about flesh and blood alone. It was about creating a myth that feeds on our need for closure, our craving for answers, our fear of the unknown. That is why his story will never truly end, because every time the case is revisited, every time a new documentary is released, every time a forum lights up with arguments about suspects and theories, the Zodiac lives again. And maybe that was always his final game, not to be caught, not to be solved, but to linger, to haunt, to prove that fear itself can be immortal. So when you turn off the lights tonight and the silence deepens around you, ask yourself, is the Zodiac dead, or is he still watching, satisfied that half a century later we are still playing his game? Because in the end, that is the cruel genius of the Zodiac. He made the world his stage and left us trapped inside the play, forced to repeat the same questions, the same theories, the same desperate attempts to claw our way toward a truth that always dissolves into smoke. And by doing so he ensured that he would never truly die, because myths do not age, they do not wither, they do not surrender to the passing of years. They survive by feeding on our fear, our fascination, our refusal to let go. Every new generation that discovers his story unknowingly becomes his accomplice, breathing life back into his legend, keeping his circle and cross carved into the walls of memory. And as long as we are haunted by the possibility of his face hiding in an old photograph, a forgotten yearbook, or the man sitting quietly across from us on the bus, then the Zodiac has already won. Because what he wanted most was not just to take lives, but to take peace, to fracture the comforting illusion that evil can always be explained, contained, punished, and ended. He taught us instead that sometimes evil lingers without resolution, that it can wear a mask that outlives the man beneath it, that it can become a riddle without an answer, and as long as his story is told, as long as his symbol is remembered, as long as his unsolved ciphers are studied under dim light by people convinced they are only a step away from breaking the code, the Zodiac remains, smiling in the shadows of history, a phantom who designed his own immortality and left us to carry the weight of it forever. So perhaps the final horror is not whether the Zodiac was ever caught, or whether he died nameless in some forgotten town, but that he designed his crimes to outlive him, crafting a legacy that thrives in the empty spaces between certainty and doubt, ensuring that even if his true face is never revealed, the fear he conjured would echo across decades like a curse no one can lift. He understood, better than most, that people fear what they cannot solve, and he weaponized that fear until it became his most enduring murder weapon, striking not at the bodies of his victims alone, but at the psyche of an entire nation that still trembles at the thought of him. Every cipher left unsolved is another ghost that refuses to rest. Every taunting letter a reminder that the story belongs not to the police who chased him, nor to the journalists who immortalized him, but to him alone, the author of a performance we cannot stop watching. In this way, the Zodiac is more than a killer. He is a mirror reflecting back our deepest dread, that evil can walk among us smiling, blending in, and never be caught, never be named, never be undone. And so his legacy endures not because of who he was, but because of who he could be. Anyone, anywhere, at any time. And that is why, when the night is quiet and the world falls still, his shadow stretches across our thoughts, whispering that some monsters do not disappear, they simply wait for us to remember them. And maybe that is why, even now, long after the blood has dried and the official case files gather dust, his presence feels more alive than the countless killers who came before or after, because while others were defined by their capture or their confessions, the Zodiac carved out immortality through the void he left behind, a carefully cultivated absence that gnaws at our imagination and refuses to be silenced. He is not remembered because of the number of his victims, but because he blurred the line between reality and performance, turning every crime scene into a stage, every letter into a script, every cipher into an invitation for us to play his game. And we accepted. The police, the press, the public, and now even you, sitting here in the glow of a screen, following the trail of symbols and stories he scattered like breadcrumbs into eternity. That is the genius of his cruelty. He ensured that the moment we ask, "Who was the Zodiac?" we step into his labyrinth, where every path bends back into mystery, where the answer always remains just beyond reach, and where he waits, not as flesh and blood, but as an idea that cannot be killed. In that way, the Zodiac does not need to be alive to haunt us. His victory lies in the fact that decades later, we are still here, still searching, still speaking his name, still caught in a trap he built half a century ago, proving that his deadliest weapon was never the knife or the gun, but the story itself. And that is where the unease sharpens, because when you realize that his story has no true ending, you also realize that he planned it that way. Every unsolved cipher, every mocking taunt, every cryptic promise was less about the immediate thrill of violence and more about building a myth that would trap us in endless pursuit, a loop without resolution, where the killer becomes immortal simply because we cannot stop asking who he was. The Zodiac turned murder into a performance, and the world into his audience, and by refusing to give us closure, he condemned us to keep replaying the act, feeding his legend with each new theory, each new suspect, each new desperate attempt to decode his puzzles. That is why he is still here, not as a man walking the earth, but as an idea that creeps into documentaries, forums, late-night whispers, and the unsettled silence before sleep. He is the figure just out of reach, the riddle that laughs at our need for answers, the shadow that proves some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. And maybe that was always his true masterpiece, not the killings themselves, but the afterlife of terror he engineered, an eternal echo reminding us that evil is never as far away as we want to believe. Because in the absence of resolution, the Zodiac becomes something larger than the man who once walked under that name, something closer to a myth stitched into the fabric of fear itself, feeding on speculation and thriving in the unknown. An unfinished story that demands to be told again and again, each retelling breathing new life into a phantom that refuses to fade. He exists in the margins of police reports, in the shaky handwriting of his letters, in the cryptic symbols that still taunt even the brightest codebreakers, and in the imagination of everyone who dares to wonder if he still lingers among us in disguise. That is his truest power, to remind us that some monsters do not live and die within the boundaries of time, but instead build themselves into legends that cannot be buried, legends that make us look twice at strangers, that unsettle the quiet moments of solitude, that haunt us precisely because we cannot cage them with certainty. The Zodiac's greatest crime may not have been the lives he took, but the way he ensured that decades later we would still whisper his name, still trace his symbols, still shiver at the thought that the story is not finished, and maybe never will be. And perhaps that is why the Zodiac endures more like a curse than a case, because he left behind not just victims but questions, questions that rot into obsessions, that drive investigators, journalists, and ordinary people into sleepless nights, chasing a face that may no longer exist, and yet the chase itself becomes the point, the ritual that keeps his shadow alive. Every time someone stares too long at his ciphers, or compares handwriting samples under a magnifying glass, or redraws his map of San Francisco Bay, they are stepping back into the game he designed, a game he knew could outlast him, because it was never built to be won. The very lack of closure is what keeps him present, what allows him to bleed through history into modern times, until his crimes no longer belong to the late 1960s and early 70s, but to every moment we retell them, every conversation we reignite, every shiver we pass along. In that sense, the Zodiac is not just a man, but a story that owns us, a reminder that some mysteries never want to be solved, because their power lies in the silence that follows, in the doubt that lingers, in the terrible thought that he could have been anyone, anywhere, and that by still speaking of him, still searching for him, still fearing him, we have made him exactly what he wanted to be, eternal. And in that eternity lies the cruelest truth of all, that the Zodiac does not need to be alive to keep winning, because his victory is measured not in bodies, but in the persistence of our fear, in the endless speculation that fuels documentaries, books, podcasts, and whispered theories, each one a candle keeping his shadow flickering on the walls of our imagination. He has become a shape without form, a name without a face, a cipher without a key, and this very incompleteness makes him more terrifying than any killer who was caught and unmasked. Because he is not contained by a mugshot or a courtroom sentence, he is free to drift like smoke into every possibility, every doubt, every stranger's face that seems just a little too familiar. And so the Zodiac lingers, not as a man hiding in the dark, but as the darkness itself, the embodiment of the question that cannot be answered, the story that will not end, the proof that sometimes evil's greatest trick is not in what it does, but in how deeply it makes us need to keep looking for it. And maybe that's why his legacy feels heavier with every passing year, because the longer time stretches without resolution, the more the Zodiac transforms from a killer into a myth, an ever-expanding shadow that swallows fact and fiction alike, until what we're left with is not a case file, but a legend, a presence that stalks culture itself. He exists in the liminal space between crime and folklore, between history and nightmare, where each new generation discovers his story and adds their own layer of obsession, keeping his ghost alive even as the real man has long since vanished into the anonymity of time. That is the brilliance and the terror of what he created. A puzzle with no solution, a theater with no final act, a story designed to never close its curtain, ensuring that we, the unwilling audience, keep watching, keep guessing, keep fearing. And in that way, the Zodiac is no longer bound to the Bay Area or the late 1960s. He is everywhere, anywhere our imaginations wander, proof that sometimes the most enduring monsters are not the ones who strike the hardest, but the ones who vanish before we can ever truly name them. And so the Zodiac becomes less of a man and more of an echo, a riddle stretched across decades, whispering through yellowed police reports, faded crime scene photographs, and the trembling memories of survivors who still feel his shadow pressed against their lives. His story coils itself tighter the more we try to unravel it, because each theory that claims to expose him only deepens the mystery. Each suspect that seems convincing eventually dissolves into doubt, and each cipher solved leads to another door left locked. That is why his presence endures, not as a fugitive hiding in some forgotten corner of the world, but as a haunting that refuses to loosen its grip, feeding off our need for closure, off our desperation to draw a line under the chaos he created. The Zodiac thrives in that hunger, because every time we speak his name, every time we search for his face in the crowd, every time we sit in the dark and wonder if he's still out there, we give him the immortality he designed for himself. And that is the true horror. That half a century later, he still owns us, not with bullets or knives, but with the silence he left behind, a silence that grows louder every time we listen, because the silence he left behind is not empty at all. It is alive, filled with the scratching of unsolved symbols, the laughter buried in his taunting letters, the weight of unfinished police files stacked like gravestones to memory, each one a reminder that the story was never meant to be finished. It is a silence that asks questions without offering answers, a silence that bends time so that what happened in the Bay Area streets more than 50 years ago feels like it could happen again tomorrow, as if the Zodiac never left but only learned how to dissolve into rumor, into theory, into the uneasy suspicion that he could be anyone. That is what makes his legend so unbearable. It forces us to stare into the abyss of uncertainty, to admit that some nightmares refuse to be solved, that some faces will always remain hidden in the crowd. And the more we try to force the silence to confess, the more it devours us, until all we are left with is the realization that perhaps the Zodiac was never just a man at all, but the embodiment of the one thing humanity fears most, not death, not violence, but the eternal weight of never knowing. And in that eternal weight of never knowing lies the essence of his control, because the Zodiac's true weapon was not his gun or his knife, but the way he fractured certainty itself, leaving behind a trail of questions that would metastasize across generations, infecting investigators, historians, and ordinary people alike with the gnawing compulsion to search for answers that were never meant to exist. Each cipher was less a code to be broken than a seed planted in our collective psyche, designed to grow into an obsession that outlives both the killer and his victims, ensuring that even decades later we would still be tangled in his design. The fact that he could vanish without a trace, dissolve into anonymity while his name became infamous, proves how deliberately he staged the performance. By never giving us his face, he gave us infinity, an endless gallery of suspects, a carousel of possibilities where every new name feels like revelation until it collapses under the weight of doubt. That uncertainty is the prison he built for us, one with no walls, no bars, only the relentless echo of a name that was never caught, never unmasked, never silenced. And perhaps that is the most chilling truth of all, that the Zodiac does not end, because the Zodiac was never supposed to end. He was meant to linger, to haunt, to remind us that evil does not die when a man does, but when we finally stop looking. And maybe that is why the story of the Zodiac feels less like history and more like a living organism, feeding on every new theory, every book, every documentary, every late-night conversation where someone leans in and whispers, "What if he was never caught because he was never who we thought he was?" Because in that moment, the legend grows stronger, stretching its reach beyond the Bay Area into the collective imagination of the world. He becomes the symbol of the unsolvable, a mirror held up to our own obsession with certainty, daring us to confront the possibility that some truths are not just hidden, but deliberately unreachable, crafted to torment us by their absence. And the longer we search, the more his shadow twists into something far larger than a single man, until he is no longer defined by the crimes he committed, but by the endless labyrinth of speculation left in their wake, a labyrinth with no exit. That is the true horror, that in trying to define him, we have become trapped inside his design, unable to step away, unable to accept that the answer may never come. And so we remain here, half a century later, still listening for a voice that may never speak again, still scanning the crowd for a face that may never exist, still haunted by the thought that perhaps the Zodiac's greatest masterpiece was not the murders at all, but the way he ensured his presence would never truly die. And so his presence drifts through time like smoke, impossible to grasp, yet impossible to ignore, seeping into every corner of our culture until he is less a murderer than a specter woven into the fabric of fear itself, a reminder that human cruelty can be both intimate and infinite when left without resolution. Every unsolved letter is a wound that refuses to heal. Every cipher, a door that opens into another hallway of speculation. Every suspect's face a mirror that reflects back nothing but our own uncertainty. And in this way, the Zodiac ensures that he is not bound to the crimes of the past, but resurrected each time his story is told, each time someone dares to ask, who was he? His identity may be buried under decades of silence, but silence itself has become his weapon, louder than any confession, heavier than any captured truth. And the more we chase him, the more we become prisoners of the endless maze he constructed. That is why, even now, his shadow stretches farther than his crimes ever did, turning him into something both greater and more terrifying than a man, into a myth of unfinished horror, into a darkness that cannot be caged by justice, into a question that will keep whispering long after all who remember him are gone. And perhaps that is the cruelest design of all, that we are still here, half a century later, trapped in a story that refuses to give us its ending, replaying the same questions, circling the same suspects, staring at the same unsolved lines of code as if sheer obsession might bend reality enough to conjure the truth, yet knowing deep down that this is exactly what he wanted. Every time the case resurfaces in headlines, every time a new, definitive suspect is paraded before the public only to collapse under scrutiny, every time someone claims to have cracked a cipher, the Zodiac wins again. Because the spectacle lives on. Because he is remembered. Because he is fed by our need to solve him. He understood what few killers ever do. That fear is fleeting, but mystery is eternal. And by choosing to vanish into the unknown, he secured a legacy that not even death could erase. The murders were brutal, yes, but they were only the prologue. The real performance is what we are living now, this endless theater of speculation and dread where we, the audience, cannot leave because the curtain never falls. And so the Zodiac remains, not in prison, not in a grave, but in us, etched into the restless part of the human mind that cannot accept the words unsolved, that cannot walk away from a riddle left hanging in the dark. And that is why the Zodiac's shadow lingers like an open wound across time, because what he carved into history was not just violence, but a story without resolution, a puzzle that feeds on its own incompleteness, growing larger with every failed attempt to solve it, until he is no longer confined to the blood-stained nights of the 1960s, but reborn in every conversation, every theory, every sleepless thought that wonders if evil can hide forever. His letters were not just taunts, they were seeds, designed to take root in the minds of strangers yet unborn, ensuring that long after his body turned to dust, his voice would still whisper from the margins of unsolved files, from the flicker of late-night documentaries, from the unease that creeps in when we realize that he could have been anyone. And if he could have been anyone, then perhaps he still could be. That is the brilliance and the horror of his design. The killings were finite, but the uncertainty is endless, and in that endlessness lies his true immortality. Because the Zodiac never needed to be caught, never needed to be unmasked, never even needed to keep killing. He only needed us to keep asking, to keep searching, to keep breathing life into a ghost that refuses to fade. And as long as we do, his story will never die, because the Zodiac is not gone. He is the question itself, and the question will outlive us all. And in that realization comes the deepest terror of all, that the Zodiac has transcended the limits of flesh and time, that he has become less a man than a curse, a lingering infection of the human mind, a reminder that the scariest monsters are not the ones we catch, but the ones that remain uncatchable, living in the space between fact and myth. Every other killer, no matter how infamous, eventually has their face exposed, their story catalogued, their end sealed by death or justice, but the Zodiac resists this closure, and in resisting it, he achieves something darker than any capture could deny him. He becomes eternal, the cipher that will never be solved, the suspect who will never be confirmed, the silence that will never break. All of these are his true weapons, sharper and deadlier than any knife, because they cut across generations, keeping the wound forever open. And so he survives not in his own survival, but in ours, survives in the hours we give him, in the theories we spin, in the sleepless nights of investigators who knew they were chasing a shadow, in the ordinary people who look into the faces of strangers and wonder if they are staring into the eyes of a ghost. The Zodiac is not finished, because the Zodiac was never meant to finish. He is the endless echo of the unknown, and as long as we cannot let go, he will never let us go either. And that endless echo is what traps us, because unlike stories with clean endings, the Zodiac's tale is one that refuses to resolve, and in its refusal, it forces us into complicity. We become the caretakers of his myth, the keepers of his shadow, the ones who feed his legacy simply by remembering. The unanswered questions claw at us. Was he a lone predator or a ghost within a larger machine? Did he die quietly, unnoticed, while the world still trembled at his name? Or is he still out there, laughing at how we build shrines of speculation around his absence? These questions do not fade with time, they sharpen, because with every passing year, the gap between the killings and the present widens, and yet the unease does not shrink. If anything, it grows, because a truth denied too long becomes something monstrous, an idea larger than any reality could ever be. And so, the Zodiac thrives in this impossible space, living not as a man, but as a presence, haunting the line between fact and myth, thriving in our fear of the unresolved, reminding us that sometimes the scariest story is not the one with blood on its pages, but the one that ends with a blank line, daring us to fill it in ourselves. And perhaps that is the final twisted genius of the Zodiac, that his murders, brutal as they were only the surface, a spark meant to ignite something far more enduring, an eternal uncertainty that shackles itself to the human need for answers, feeding off the obsession of detectives, journalists, and ordinary people who cannot accept the idea that evil can vanish without a trace. He designed his legacy like a puzzle with missing pieces, knowing we would never stop trying to complete it, knowing that each new theory, each new suspect, each new solution to his codes would only tighten the grip of his myth, ensuring that his shadow would never fade, but instead multiply across time. In this way, the Zodiac's true crime was not the taking of lives, but the stealing of closure, the denial of finality, the creation of a story that never ends. We keep him alive with every whispered speculation, every late-night search for hidden patterns, every retelling of his deeds, until the killer himself is irrelevant, and what remains is something much larger, a void given form, a question turned into a monster, a story that owns us more than we own it. And that story, unfinished and unsolvable, is where the Zodiac still breathes, not in the past, but here, now, wherever the need to know collides with the impossibility of knowing. And so the myth stretches on, longer and darker with every retelling, until the Zodiac is no longer just a man who once walked among us, but a figure that belongs to something older, a whisper carried in every culture's fear of the unknown predator, the faceless hunter who strikes and then disappears, leaving behind not answers, but scars. The passage of time, instead of burying him, has only stripped away the edges of fact and polished the uncertainty into legend, so that now he stands not alongside ordinary killers, but beside archetypes, the boogeyman, the phantom, the monster in the dark. And yet the chilling part is that he was real, real enough to carve his mark into living victims, real enough to fill police files with blood and ink, real enough to laugh in the face of the entire system meant to stop him. The duality is what makes him so terrifying. The Zodiac is both myth and man, both unspeakably ordinary and unimaginably untouchable, both gone and still here. That paradox keeps him breathing through us, feeding on our inability to separate the killer from the story from the obsession from the need to solve what cannot be solved. And in that cycle, he wins, again and again, every time we say his name. And every time his name is spoken, it reopens the wound he carved into the world, because the Zodiac is not just remembered, he is summoned, drawn back into the present as if he never left, as if the decades that separate us from his crimes collapse into nothing the moment we begin to wonder again who he was, why he did it, and how he could vanish so completely. He is not preserved in evidence bags or dusty case files, but in the living breath of our speculation, in the restless itch that demands a face, a motive, a final chapter. But the brilliance of his horror is that he gave us nothing solid, only fragments, taunts written in code, symbols scrawled like curses, claims of murders that may or may not have happened, and a silence that swallows every attempt to pin him down. The absence is his weapon, the uncertainty his masterpiece, because it forces us to finish the story ourselves, to imagine endless versions of the truth, each one darker than the last. And in doing so, we become part of his design, his accomplices in immortality, carrying forward the myth that ensures the Zodiac will never truly die, because the question of who he was is not just unanswered, it is unanswerable, and that impossibility is what makes him eternal, and that eternity is what chills the soul, because the Zodiac's presence has outlived the men and women who once chased him, outlived the voices of victims' families who pleaded for closure, outlived the era of paper letters and rotary phones that defined his reign of terror. And yet he remains, shape-shifting into every medium, every generation, a ghost that adapts with time. In the 1970s, he was the faceless man on wanted posters. In the 1990s, he was a name whispered in unsolved mystery shows. Today, he exists as a digital phantom, decoded and redecoded by thousands of anonymous minds across forums, podcasts, and late-night threads, each convinced they are inches away from unveiling the truth. But no matter how close they come, the truth slides away, like water through clenched fists, leaving only obsession in its place. And that is the genius of the Zodiac's cruelty. He didn't just kill people, he killed certainty itself, replacing it with an unending labyrinth of doubt that consumes more lives than his weapons ever did. The fear he planted has grown roots deeper than his crimes, and those roots now stretch into our collective psyche, proving that the Zodiac doesn't need to exist as a man anymore. He exists as an idea, and ideas, unlike men, cannot die.